We're going to look at the gray matter and the white matter in the central nervous system and also in the spinal cord. So let's look at sections of the brain. We have the cerebrum, the cerebellum, which is in the very posterior region of the brain back here. And below that is the medulla oblongata, which is part of the brainstem. You should know that the brainstem has three major parts. One of the important things to know for this chapter are the parts of the diencephalon, the parts of the brainstem, which would be the midbrain, is the most superior portion. Then there is the pons, and then the medulla oblongata. So in the cross section of the cerebellum, we can see the fourth ventricle, and the fourth ventricle is what contains cerebral spinal fluid. Within the central nervous system, specifically the brain, there are a group of four ventricles, which are open spaces where cerebrospinal fluid flows. Below the region of the cerebellum and the brainstem, the very bottom of the brainstem is the medulla, and we can see the fourth ventricle shown in it as well, which is also going to have cerebrospinal fluid in it. That ventricle then continues down into the spinal cord in a region called the central canal. So the central canal has cerebrospinal fluid in it. Surrounding the central nervous system are a group of meninges, and those meninges from outer to inner are the dura mater, which is the tough outermost layer. Then underneath that, we have the arachnoid mater. And then the innermost meninge is called the pia mater. It's a very thin layer that adheres very tightly to the brain. It almost looks like shrink wrap when you observe a brain closely. Now, between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater is the subarachnoid space between the two. Let's zoom in on the diagram to the right here, and we can see the outermost dura mater has two specific layers that make it up. You can see that it is directly deep to the bone of the skull. And directly on top of that is the epidural space. So when they administer an epidural medication, they put a needle into the epidural space, which is on top of the dura mater in the spinal cord region. The middle layer is the arachnoid mater. Directly underneath that is the subarachnoid space. And then the deepest meninge, directly on top of the cerebral cortex, is the pia mater. So we can see the outer gray matter, which makes up the cerebral cortex of the cerebral hemispheres. The ventricles that I just mentioned are cavities within the brain that contain CSF, which is cerebrospinal fluid. And as I mentioned, there are four ventricles. The first two, we don't call them ventricle 1 and 2 because they're both at the same anatomical location within each hemisphere. Those two lateral hemispheres are separated by a thin membrane called the septum pellucidum, and we can see them located on our diagram to the right. The third ventricle is in the diencephalon. And again, it's important for you to remember that the diencephalon is the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and finally, the epithalamus. And the epithalamus is actually the pineal gland, which produces melatonin, a chemical that helps you go to sleep. So continuous with the third ventricle, located down here, is the fourth ventricle. And the fourth ventricle is between the pons and the cerebellum. So it's located in this juncture right here. So anterior to that would be the pons, and this would be the medulla oblongata. The fourth ventricle merges with the central canal in the center of the spinal cord. So the cerebrum is where we have conscious thought, and it's where the origin of intellectual functions are. So it has many neurons needed for complex analytical functions. So it contains an outer cortex, that's that gray matter, the inner white matter, and also deep regions of gray matter called cerebral nuclei. When we look at its surface, it's marked by gyri, which are the ridges, and sulci, which are the grooves. There are then also deep grooves, which are called fissures. So a fissure is actually different than a sulcus. A sulcus would be shallow, a shallow groove, and a fissure would be a very deep groove. The cerebral hemispheres have two halves. This is what we commonly refer to as the left and the right brain, and they are left and right hemispheres. The hemispheres are divided by a longitudinal fissure that extends down the mid-sagittal plane. So that would separate the right and the left hemisphere. The hemispheres are separate, except at a few places where they actually connect, and they connect with bundles of axons or tracks. And now we know that axons are myelinated white matter. We would expect to see those connections as white matter. And the one example of that is the corpus callosum. It's the largest tract that connects the two hemispheres. And that's what we see on this slide. We can see the left cerebral hemisphere and the right cerebral hemisphere. You can see the central sulcus, which was shown earlier on an image. So it's this particular line. Then there are various gyri. Just in front of the central sulcus is an important gyrus called the precentral gyrus. Just behind it is another important gyrus called the postcentral gyrus. So what separates the two hemispheres now is a fissure called the longitudinal fissure. So it separates along this dotted line that we can see on the left and the right of our image. So the different lobes within the cerebral hemispheres that you should know are 5 different lobes, one of which you can't see from the outside. The frontal lobe would be where the frontal bone is. So there's one of those. There are 2 parietal lobes, and they would be on the most superior region of the cerebrum. Then there are 2 temporal lobes, kind of on the lateral side of the cerebrum, followed by 1 occipital lobe, and then the insula. The insula is the one that's more difficult to see, and it's deep to the other lobes. This image is showing the various cerebral lobes. So we can see, related to the central sulcus, that anterior to the central sulcus is the frontal lobe. This is where the primary motor cortex would be located at, the motor speech area called the Broca's area. The parietal lobe is posterior to the central sulcus. It's where we have what's called a primary somatosensory cortex. The occipital lobe is for vision. The temporal lobe is for hearing, where the auditory cortex is. And finally, the insula, which, as you can see is deep here. So the only reason that we can see the insula is because these other lobes surrounding it have been retracted. The insula contains the gustatory cortex, which is taste. So on the cadaver image to the right here, we can see the temporal lobe highlighted. So you should be able to identify the 4 basic lobes that you could see. So you don't have to be able to identify the insula.